Hideo Kojima is seen as one of the most prominent voices in the video game industry today, and he's revered by his peers and gamers alike. He is often mentioned as a visionary director, one who molds his vision into a piece of video game art. Although under Konami's wing he had worked on several games, including the Metal Gear series, Kojima truly rose to prominence during the PlayStation 1 era with the release of Metal Gear Solid. As we all know, the mother bird had a gambling problem, and when she decided she'd much rather put all of her eggs in the pachinko basket, Kojima was thrown out of the nest, provoking a massive controversy and driving grown men to the brink of tears. Personally, I was a little too late to the party to be swept up in the first wave of Metal Gear Solid hype. As a teenager, I found Metal Gear Solid unique and entertaining, although somewhat confusing due to the many plot lines and twists. Back in the day, I enjoyed both MGS1 and 2, but only played and finished 3 and 4 for the first time last year. This last experience really made me look back on the series and question how these games were so universally praised. MGS1 may have been revolutionary for its presentation, but it is the series' ever-increasing emphasis on storytelling that becomes its biggest detractor. After MGS1, rather than maturing as a director and trying to find a way to ground the Metal Gear universe, Kojima keeps increasing the stakes to the point that the stories in these games become incoherent collections of themes and tropes. In this respect, I found the trajectory of the Metal Gear Solid franchise similar to what happened to Star Wars with the prequel trilogy, where you have George Lucas, who gets complete creative control without anyone around him to rein him in or help shape his ideas. This video analysis will make the same argument for Metal Gear Solid, focusing on its famously epic, wacky, convoluted narrative and how Hideo Kojima's absolute control of the series leads it down a path where instead of having MGS1 as the ultimate standalone cult classic, each game becomes increasingly more talkative and intrusive, causing the story to lose aim of its core themes and devolve into a disconnected mess of entangled plotlines.
Nanomachines, 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 nanomachines.
Nanomachines.
I see the narrative as by far the biggest issue that plagues this series. Which is why I wanted to focus on this part specifically, especially because it is Kojima's storytelling and direction that is often praised. Apart from a few outlets, its blemishes are usually overlooked by major publications that shower these games with praise, in my eyes proving that the quality standards for stories in video games and movies are still miles apart. This is not a problem for many games that find a suitable balance between story and gameplay, but the Solid series is impossible to consider without its hours of cutscenes and codec calls that break up the gameplay. It's come to the point where people have come to revere Kojima's storytelling as some of the best in the industry, leading to a re-evaluation of Metal Gear Solid 2 as a postmodern masterpiece, as well as going to extremes to connected dots in the latest trailer for Death Stranding. Just what could a bunch of vehicular tentacles and a winking baby have in common? As far as I can see, their biggest similarity is that they're both in a game whose creator writes references to Hollywood action movies in the bylines of his scripts. In this video series, I will analyze the themes, characters, and overall story of the Metal Gear Solid games. I won't pretend to cover every element of the narrative, but instead I will highlight what to me seem to be the most obvious examples of bad storytelling. The internet is an angry place. That is why at the end of each discussion, I'll try to give each video a little twist by providing my own take on how some of the narrative issues could have been remedied. This brings me to my final point before we get into MGS1. You might ask why you should even care about any of this stuff, and really, that's up to you. I can only tell you what moved me to write an undergraduate-length thesis on a game series that tries its best to convince you that a man born on D-Day hypnotized himself into thinking he was possessed by the arm of the cloned son of a legendary super soldier. And the reason I did so is because I care about video game stories. And it's because if you enjoy video game stories like I do, I think we could stand to gain from taking a more critical stance in order to keep influential creators like Hideo Kojima on their toes. You have a certain subset of people that claim stories are not important in video games, but I disagree. Games come in many different shapes and forms and have the unique ability to connect to the player directly by making them an active part of the experience. There's so many times that an engaging story has enhanced my enjoyment of the game and made me feel more emotionally invested. So, having said that, feel free to call me a disgusting man-child in the comments, but it would be great if we could get some actual discussion going. Just note that we're gonna veto arguments like, "It's crazy because it's so Japanese!" Because that just doesn't really explain why vampires fit the narrative of a nuclear espionage thriller. On a related note, saying that Kojima's just a perv, get over it, does nothing to justify that the depiction of female characters and romance in this series usually falls somewhere in between juvenile and embarrassing. Now, I'm not saying that games can't be sexy, and I'm not even completely opposed to a moderate level of fanservice, but I draw the line when it becomes so overt that it gets in the way of the story's credibility. From what it seems so far, with its winking babies, tethered Mickelsons, and tentacle tanks, the story in Kojima's latest game is not exactly taking the back seat. With the current break from Konami, the public outcry resulting from it, and Jeff Keighley breaking down 2 times in a row at the Game Awards now, and most importantly, Kojima now finally moving on to a new IP, I feel this is a good point to reflect on the series that solidified Kojima's name as one of gaming's most influential voices. Hideo Kojima has the unique position where he can mold a game to match his vision. As video game enthusiasts, we have to make sure that he's kept on his toes. In a perfect world, this should be to everyone's benefit. Without further ado, let's dive right into the PS1 watershed title, Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid was released on the PlayStation 1 to universal acclaim. From a narrative point of view, this is the leanest entry in the series. Slippery stealth legend Solid Snake is sent in to rescue the world from a super weapon called Metal Gear Rex. This weapon was captured by his clone brother Liquid Snake and his band of rebels. There's twists and turns where the player finds out the person in charge of the mission, Colonel Campbell, is holding back information, Snake's old mentor, Master Miller, has been killed, while Gray Fox, a person Snake thought he killed, is actually alive. On the other hand, we can at least say that vampires, bug people, bee people, dead people, the Patriots, the President of the United States, the former President of the United States, and the Founding Fathers have decided to stay out of this one. It's not difficult to see why this game received the amount of praise it did upon its release, especially considering that it came out during the first era of 3D games on console. Its cinematic presentation, including a fully voice-acted cast and excellent production values, were unique to the medium. However, we can already see many of the elements that will increasingly come to plague the series in following entries, although they are still quite innocent here.
Who are you? Just call me Deep Throat. Deep Throat.
Metal Gear Solid sprinkles in some hints of a deeper subject matter, but at its core, its plot aspires mostly to create an action-filled adventure about a badass hero saving the world. The theme of the game is summarized in one word: Gene. The story deals with how Solid and Liquid Snake are programmed for battle, as are the Genome soldiers that guard the Shadow Moses facility. Liquid seizes the facility and demands the US government turns over the body of Big Boss, their clone daddy, which he plans to use to create an army of super soldiers. He also needs Snake's genes to cure them of a mysterious virus. Later, it becomes apparent that Snake was injected with Fox Dye, a virus that is able to target specific people. It's far-fetched, but at least it matches the theme of the game. In general, the game does not lose its focus on its core themes of war and humanity's predisposed nature to attract conflict, and this adds to the consistency of the plot, making it more enjoyable as a result. For this first game in the series, I want to focus mostly on the characterization of Snake, the overall writing, and how MGS1 lays the foundation for many of the narrative issues of its sequels. Note that generally I'm not going to discuss voice acting that much, because Hideo Kojima speaks very little English and did not direct the English dub in any of these games. Instead, let's start with Snake's characterization as a 14-year-old boy trapped in a soldier's body.
Who are you?
The writing in Metal Gear Solid 1 is hokey from the start. Snake's character as a legendary soldier is undermined in the first 30 minutes of his mission, as he's caught off guard by both a rookie agent and a security camera. Not really a good look for a legendary soldier.
A surveillance camera?
Another nice double whammy is when Snake performs some textbook sexual harassment in the workplace on Mei Ling, when he tells her he didn't expect her to be so cute, even though he can't see her because he's talking through his codec. As we'll see throughout the series, Kojima has trouble crafting a believable display of human romance, because every time he attempts to do so, it falls apart either due to the dialogue or because he had difficulty choosing between blatant sex appeal and portraying a believable relationship. Although this becomes especially apparent in later entries, we see some hints of it already in MGS1. Snake starts out as a charmer as he flirts with Mei Ling and Naomi and ogles Meryl. The game's script at times becomes tone deaf when it tries to marry Snake's tortured mercenary persona to his inner horn dog. He'll be talking about the tragedy of war in one moment, and then switch up the conversation to Meryl's ass in the next one. On one occasion, this happens in the span of 30 seconds.
I've got no purpose in life, no ultimate goal.
Come on.
It's only when I'm cheating death on the battlefield, the only time I feel truly alive. I never forget a lady.
So there's something you like about me, huh?
Yeah, you've got a great butt.
It's obvious that Snake is the ultimate power fantasy for teenage boys. He's the dark and brooding soldier, but he's also an ass man, and the ladies love him. Snake's brooding nature gains the upper hand when his favorite pair of ass cheeks gets shot straight in the vagina by Sniper Wolf. Snake doesn't like this and laments to Otacon that if he truly were an action hero, he would have saved the girl. Otacon says sorry, but not really, as he starts talking immediately after that about how he loves the woman who just perforated Snake's girl with bullets.
Do you think love can bloom, even on a battlefield?
Yeah, it's called Stockholm Syndrome. At the end of the day, much of the game's dialogue is delivered straight from the cheese factory, but intentional or not, I can look past most of it for this game. At the end of the game, depending on the outcome of the torture scene, Snake ends up with Meryl, which makes sense in an action movie sort of way considering all they've been through. Besides some stilted dialogue and romance, we have of course a flying psychic and a ninja to really make us question what kind of universe it is that these characters operate in. Around the time MGS1 was released, video games were transitioning into the mainstream, and I feel like you could get away with stuff like this, brushing it off as Japanese wackiness as a means to explain something we otherwise had no rational way of explaining. Or maybe we just didn't really care that much. It is never explained why people can fly, or exactly why Grey Fox turned out to be a super badass cloaking ninja. The game just expects us to roll with it. This is also why I never really understood why people had a problem with the scenes that were added to the GameCube re-release, because Metal Gear Solid, by nature, had always been over the top. Well, that is, unless you were fooled into thinking that you were actually witnessing a bold statement against the use of nuclear weapons. MGS1 attempts to connect to the player through the bittersweet tragedy of its characters always being drawn to the battlefield. But at the same time, it wants to show you explosions, ninjas, and flying psychics. It's a prime example of the Japanese approach to storytelling back in the day, where developers thought that referencing philosophy actually made their stories intelligent by association. Metal Gear Solid does the same thing, when it ends on a sobering note about the amount of nuclear weapons still being present in today's world. However, just because you've made a story about a nuclear robot, that doesn't mean you also made a statement about the state of nuclear disarmament, or the way nuclear weapons influence the course of history. Hideo Kojima wrote a story about cool explosions, an action hero, and a Japanese-style giant robot. At no point did the game's story earn the right to lecture the player. It's silly and represents the rift between what some perceive to be highbrow storytelling versus plain old action pulp. But I can let it slide, because as opposed to its sequels, MGS1 is in general not all that preachy. And that's why I'd classify these as minor complaints in the larger context of MGS1. There's plenty of wonky elements at play, but I'd argue that here particularly there's still a certain charm to it, also because of the fact that it features an unprecedented level of presentation that became a benchmark for the industry. It's a game that can be remembered fondly for its fun action movie plot and colorful, over-the-top characters. And that brings me to my final question: should we fix anything about MGS1? And to be honest, there isn't much that I would change about this game's story. It is by no means a great piece of storytelling, but seen as a product of its time, and by virtue of there not being anything like it on the market, you can easily see how this was the coolest thing in the world when it was released. If the series had stopped at MGS1, I actually wouldn't change a thing and leave it as a snapshot of video game history, as an example of games being propelled into the mainstream and transforming into big budget enterprises. MGS1 would stand as the ultimate campy cult hit. Now, if there's anything that retroactively influences my opinion of MGS1, it is that it set a precedent for the jamboree of pseudo-philosophical nonsense that followed in its wake. Kojima decides to double down on all of the first game's questionable elements. Subsequent entries to the series continue to feature supernatural characters that undermine the serious message that Kojima tries to inject into the franchise. So much so that the entire plot of MGS4 is dedicated to explaining how everything fits the series canon and completely falls apart as a result. One could argue that MGS1 should have set the rules for the rest of the Solid series. To be more concrete, at some point a choice should have been made between proceeding with a semi-realistic spy story that deals with betrayal and family feuds between clone soldiers, or to down the bottle completely and introduce robotic vampire tentacle babies. The latter is fine, but don't expect me to also accept your 20-minute ramblings on the state of the world when I've just finished running from a crazy Soviet terrorist riding on top of a tank that he's controlling with his electrical superpowers. But we'll talk about Naked Snake soon enough. At the end of the day, I do like MGS1 for its schizophrenic approach to storytelling. As a cult classic, it would have been perfect. The problem, as I'll point out in subsequent videos, is that the series never really matured when it comes to the quality of the writing and outlining the core tenets that ground the story. Instead, Kojima expands on all of the first game's questionable elements and runs with it. I'll talk more about the poster child for this claim in the next video. For now, thanks for watching, and considering that this is the first video I did of this kind, I would appreciate any feedback, so drop me a line in the comments, and hope you enjoyed.